Hello, and thank you for joining us for this special episode on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, with funding support from the Government of Canada. The Roots and Hoots podcast is produced by the Legacy Hope Foundation, a national, Indigenous-led charitable organization that has been working to promote healing and reconciliation in Canada for over 25 years. September 30th is a time when our country comes together in spirit and in action to honor the children who never returned home, along with survivors of residential schools, their families, and communities. This episode highlights just some of our exceptional guests, titled A Message to Canadians. You will hear important perspectives from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis survivors, lawyers, scholars, elders, and youth leaders, along with allies who help shed light on the ongoing journey of truth and reconciliation. We hope you enjoy this episode and that it helps to fuel the fire within.
Hello, my name is Gordon Spence, and I am the host for Indigenous Roots and Hoots. Upcoming are two respected Blackfoot community members, Peigan elder Harley Bastien and scholar Dr. Apooyak'ii, Tiffany, and Prete.
Reconciliation between the modern day Canadians and First Nations people, natives of here. As I could say, to me, words aren't what we should be using. And that goes from the classroom all the way up to the Prime Minister and all points in between. Words are like dreams. Words are like a thought. Here one moment, gone the next, soon forgot. If we want true reconciliation and we want to step off in that direction in a meaningful way, in the true way, never mind, let's put meaningful aside, the truth, because we all know the truth will set us free. Say that in jest. I would say that we take all the half of the history, Canadian history, if not all of it, and rewrite it in a true way. We've contributed in many conflicts, right back to the 1700s, where we helped push the British Yankees back. We backed up the British Canadians as native people, right up to the present day.
Yeah.
We fought in wars valiantly. And so, to say this and to say that and pass a little bit of, one bit of legislation and apology and here on TV and this and that. I mean, we all get emotional. We all cry. But do we really want, to me, you asked me the question, let's rewrite history, and let's do it the truthful way. To me, that's reconciliation.
I would like you to, if you can, explain what the purpose of the residential schools was, so that people will understand what was the intent behind them.
Right. So the intent behind residential schools was to completely rid the Canadian population of Indigenous peoples. And that was written into the Indian Acts. And the way that the Canadian government decided to try and tackle this was to do it through the children. So they took the most vulnerable population in Canada and tried to destroy them. The Indian Act was written the way that it was to try and assimilate Indigenous peoples. They didn't concentrate on our elders or our older population, because they felt like in a couple of generations, all of our elders would die off, our language would die off, our ways of knowing and being would die off, and they were hoping to teach the children to be like the rest of Canada and not follow in our traditions, not follow in our language. And so they really, really concentrated on the children, and had so many rules, so many policies within these school systems to try and have children become like of Canada. And so the Canadian government felt that within a few generations of having these schools open, that we would no longer have Indigenous peoples. And that was something that didn't happen. As Indigenous peoples, we are still here today.
Next, you'll hear from Métis scholar Tricia Logan, followed by Nancy Dyson and Dan Rubenstein, who share their experiences of working at St. Michael's Residential School.
The other area I wanted to touch on, and because you're a Métis scholar and you're a Métis person yourself, and you've done some work in the Métis experience in residential schools. So, can you talk a little bit about that? And I mean, where did they go to school, and how did this happen?
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities between the day-to-day experiences that people had, First Nations or Métis or Inuit people had, but then the way that Métis people were admitted to residential schools was often quite different because the schools were built with First Nations people, in mind. Some of the first guidelines for admission to admit Métis children had to do with classing them as first or second class Métis kids. Like, in short, if you were living close to a reserve or living like an Indian, then you'd be more likely to be taken in. Like, there were Department of Indian Affairs documents that documented that if you were living like an Indian, then yeah, kind of arbitrary that way. I was having this conversation earlier just this morning about Métis kids going to residential schools or federal Indian day schools as well. And it's interesting how the rules that would be bent or not bent to allow Métis kids or stop Métis kids from coming in kind of manipulated, like, because the schools were funded per capita, like a school would get more money if they had more kids, they would fill up the school with more Métis kids because they would get more money. But then if the school was full and they'd have to move kids around, it would be the Métis kids that got moved to a different school or sent back to a different school. And there's a lot of survivors kind of have an anecdotal story about, like, oh, I went to the provincial school and they said I was an Indian, so I had to go to the residential school. When the residential school said, no, I'm a white person, I got to go back to the provincial school. And those same kind of the ways that Métis people kind of got shoved back and forth now reflect on how Métis people are or aren't able to get compensation, or were or weren't felt that they were involved in the Truth Reconciliation Commission or in the settlement agreement for a lot of those same systems and structures. Government saying, your provincial responsibility, it's a federal responsibility, and kind of all those inconsistencies still repeat themselves.
As mentioned in your introduction, St. Michael's Residential School, Lament and Legacy, is the only published book written by former childcare workers in residential schools. I'm wondering if you can tell us about the journey of writing this book. What made you decide to write it in the first place, and what was it like revisiting those years and what you had witnessed?
Well, as you said, we were very shocked when we were hired. We didn't have experience with children. We didn't have experience with Indigenous culture when we were new to Canada. And we were quite overwhelmed and really disturbed by what we saw in the school. And we were only there 4 months before Dan was fired. And we thought about the children a lot, but we didn't know what to do. And we stopped advocating. And that's really the reason we wrote the book, is that now we regret that we were silent for so many years, because the school closed in 1974, just 4 years after we were there. And when it closed, we were so relieved that the children wouldn't be suffering that kind of harsh treatment and abuse. So Dan, do you want to talk about the turning point?
I went down to the Delta when the TRC tabled its reports. It was a beautiful summer day in June. And I went in there and there were all the survivors. It was filled with emotion. It was emotion of satisfaction that finally they had a voice and they were being heard. So there was that sense of accomplishment. But then there were rooms with counselors and people were weeping and all the memories were coming back. And I went to the Anglican church. They had booths, all the booths there. And I said, do you have a history of the church? Is there something? The memories were coming back, and I got a brochure. And then I realized that the National Truth and Reconciliation Center was there and that I could give a statement. So I was taking the elevator upstairs to give the statement. And there was a man in the elevator who turned out to be Ryan Moran, who was head of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And I was filled with emotion. I blurted out and I said,
I worked in one of these schools, and now I'm going upstairs to give my statement. And he said, Dan, you need to do more because we haven't heard from the former employees. They didn't have to testify. They weren't subpoenaed. We haven't heard that. You really need to tell this story fully. And then I came home and told Nancy this experience, and she said, yes, we'll write it. So we started the writing, and it was a long, long journey. And it was much, much harder to write because there was no records to go for. And for Nancy and I, there was nothing. Like even, we never existed in the school. I couldn't have proved I was there. And what we found when we sat down together to write it was that the memories, once we accessed them and opened up that door, were very vivid because the school was unlike anything we'd ever known before, anything we've known after. And we would have faltered on this journey, I believe, because we thought, who's ever going to want to hear this story? Nancy said, call up Reconciliation Canada, see if they can help us. We got the idea that we wanted to be reunited if there were any survivors from our class. And I wanted to meet with them and apologize to them, not for anything that I did, because I was ethical, but just for having been at the school, having ever been paid for 4 months to be there. So when I called, I started to weep. I talked to the receptionist. I found myself weeping uncontrollably. I'm an auditor. I don't do things like this. This had never happened. And I was surprised. And the receptionist who was at Reconciliation Canada, she was used to tears and weeping and trauma. She said, Daniel, it's all right. Chief Joseph will be concerned about you, and he will call you back tonight. I will tell him about you. Sure enough, 6:30 at night, I get a call coming in, and it's Chief Joseph. And he says, I'm concerned about your healing, Dan. So he talked, and I wept some more and said, basically, Dan and Nancy, you have to tell your story. The survivors had to tell it first. Now you go second, and you corroborate what they said. And there are a lot of hard truths that have to be told, and you have to tell them because that's going to help our healing. So that's how we got started. And then throughout the process, he helped to sustain us.
Okay.
It was interesting because we learned that Chief Dr. Robert Joseph, who's the ambassador for Reconciliation Canada, he himself went through St. Michael's, and he shared with us, and he shared publicly, that at the school, he was physically, emotionally, and sexually abused and left the school a broken person, a broken human being, and had to do a lot of healing to arrive where he is now. He read our story multiple times, multiple drafts. The first time he read it, he emailed us and he said, I read it and I wept and I wept. And he said, but those were tears of healing. And it's through conversations like the ones we are having that we will start on the road to reconciliation.
On the topic of preserving Indigenous languages, Inuk singer-songwriter Susan Aglukark shares her perspective along with ally and professor at University of Manitoba, Peter Kulchyski.
You speak Inuk, you learned it growing up. How has knowing your language and learning to speak it, how has it influenced your way of life?
I think as an Indigenous person, as an Inuk, knowing my language has a different grounding. If I were an Inuk person and I speak just English, we feel a little bit more removed from ourselves. There's that piece of us that feels like it's missing.
Yeah.
But when you know your traditional language, there is that added knowing and grounding that we are living from.
You were also known as the Arctic Rose of the Arctic, and people love you, and you started a foundation called the Arctic Rose Foundation. Tell us a bit about that.
I again felt very fortunate that I had this incredible career. Like when I left home, I left not as a singer or a songwriter, but over a series of opportunities and happenstances, incredible people in my life in the early years. I end up with a singing career that has also been how I learned I could heal. Had it not been for the career, I would not have known that I could get better, that I could recover, that I could heal. So the things that I have learned on that journey, I needed to do something with them. So I spent the last 15 years sitting with foundations, volunteer boards, learning what is the best way to use this experience, to share this experience. Decided on the Arctic Rose Foundation because the power of the arts has this unique ability to place us equally in a space where we're not judging. I'm not going to tell you what's wrong or what's right. We're just going to sit here and we're going to create a safe place where we can figure out what's going on. We know what to do, but we're going to figure this out with you. We're going to sit here safely, emotionally, physically, culturally, spiritually safe. And we're going to discover expression through expression, what's going on in our body and our mind. And we're going to work with you through art.
Yeah.
Because had it not been for expression, songwriting, and singing, I would not have healed enough to be who I am today.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm Polish and Ukrainian. I don't speak any Polish or Ukrainian. I like to eat Kulchyskis and pierogies. Food is one of the last cultural things that leaves us, actually. But then, you know, I don't speak either of those languages. I don't dress like a, you know, traditional Pole or Ukrainian. I don't know any of that. I don't know very much about that culture. And it might be sad about that. It might personally be a loss for me. It's not a global historic loss because there are places where Polish language and culture are being practiced and are thriving. There are places where Vietnamese culture, Jamaican culture, any of the other cultures of multicultural Canada and languages, they are thriving back in their homeland. This, Canada, is the homeland for Indigenous peoples. So if Niska culture disappears from Canada, or Inuit culture, or Anishinaabe culture, there may be some Anishinaabe people in the States, there may be some Inuit people in Alaska, but we basically are losing those cultures globally. Whatever those cultures might be able to teach humanity is being rapidly, forcibly disappeared. And so that I think is a global tragedy, actually. And we in Canada are on the front lines of that. And I think it's more urgent than ever before that we try and find affirmative measures, which in law, that's what Aboriginal rights is. It's an affirmative measure to see what we can do to allow those people who want to the ability to practice their culture.
Métis historian Dr. Allyson, Stevenson, and Peigan 60 Scoop survivor, and the Legacy Home Foundation board president, Adam North Peigan, share their honest and important reflections on the impacts of the child welfare system on Indigenous peoples.
Something that I hoped my work and my continued work will help people to see is that the removal of Indigenous children from families and colonization of Indigenous kinship, which is really the key for me, didn't end, in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, but is still very much, and it's really escalating today. And there's a lot of incentives for removing children. They continue to be. I think Cindy Blackstock's done really excellent work on, exposing the kind of human rights violations that families, First Nations families and children have experienced. The underfunding of, she uses the example of child welfare, but the underfunding of all aspects of Indigenous rights in many ways that were guaranteed through treaties. So, the loss of land, the surrenders of reserves, the kind of, like you talk about Indian women losing their status, all these impact the ability of families to care for their children. And it's called the child welfare system, but no one has ever demonstrated that children's lives are improved through being removed. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Leaders, survivors, Indigenous women, activists, many people have been arguing for decades that when children are removed from their families, that it's detrimental to the communities, it's detrimental to children. There's a pipeline from the welfare system to the prison system. So, rethinking the entire legislative basis for child welfare is critically important because it's just the same thing over and over again.
For just for people who are listening and they hear this term 60 scoop, describe what the 60 scoop was about and why it was done to yourself and how it affected you as a person.
Well, you know what? As the residential schools were starting to phase out, because the residential schools started to be created by Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada. So that was in the late 1800s, right? And it spanned over probably a century, the residential schools. But when they started to close their doors, what the government of the day did, the government of Canada in 1951, they amended the Indian Act to offload the responsibility of Indigenous Child and Family Services to the provinces. So what that did is, and it was a continuation of the assimilation process of taking the Indian out of the child. And so the provinces and the territories were charged with the responsibility of going out and forcibly removing as many Indigenous children in their area and placing them in non-Indigenous foster homes and children's shelters. So that's how that whole process began. So it was an extension of the residential school era, and it was just as oppressive, or maybe even more oppressive. And for myself, I was born in 1964, and I was removed from my community by child welfare in the province of Alberta. As an infant, I was probably maybe about less than 1 year old, probably in 1965. And I come from a very large family. My family, there's 10 siblings, 10 of us all together, and we were all removed. We were all removed by Alberta's child welfare, and we were all taken from our mother, and we were placed all in separate homes. We weren't put in the same home, so I grew up in numerous non-Indigenous foster homes and children's shelters right across southern Alberta, in Lethbridge, Raymond, and children's shelters. And you know what? Some of those homes were not good. There was a lot of mental abuse. There was physical abuse. We were used as farm labor, in farming communities as little kids with expectations to do chores on the within the farm that the birth kids didn't have to do. And there was a lot of sexual abuse, and because in some of those homes it was really horrific, and so how it affected me is that whole notion of stability, having that nurturing, unconditional love from my mother. I never experienced that. Loss of culture was a big thing. There was a time in my life where I looked at the color of my skin and I was very ashamed. I was so ashamed of the color of my skin because I was brown, because I was told in my foster homes that I was dirty. And I remember in one foster home, as a little boy, I think I was probably about 5 or 6 years old, being thrown in a tub with soap and water and a brush, and told to clean my skin because I was dirty. So if you can just imagine, the trauma that goes with that, And it was just horrific, And it got worse when I came home because, like I said, I already talked about the culture shock, and and it led me down a road that I'm not very pleased with, but it's a journey that has maybe become the person that I am today.
What are the things that stood in the way, that stand in the way today? What are the beliefs that you believe that stand in the way of truly loving yourself? Because what they don't know, and what most Indigenous people don't know, and other human beings, is that we're born pure essence of love. We are not born sinners. That was written by a man, men, whatever. You don't teach things like that if you want a good world to live in. Why do you think there's so much hatred today in life? So when you're born pure essence of love, because we come from Gusemantu, like I said before, we don't come from the roots of man. That's another country's teaching. Yes, our people have, adopted that as part of their life, but that's not who we are.
Right.
So knowing that you come from Gusemantu, the nanosecond, like I said yesterday in that video, that you're consummated by your mother and your father, the spirit from Gusemantu enters that, and you begin your life. If you don't have spirit, you're dead. You're not here.
People today are talking, you hear the word reconciliation often, and
we're trying to make this world a better place, our country a better place to live, and create a better understanding, among the indigenous, non-indigenous people, and also people come here from other countries. So we're trying to make this country a better place for everybody to live in harmony. And the word reconciliation is the word that's been used a lot in trying to get this better understanding happening. What is your feelings on reconciliation? What kind of message would you deliver to people in general?
Yeah. Well, first of all, like I said, as human beings, we are born with spirit. What we don't understand is why we have spirit and how to live from that, because it wouldn't matter what country you came from. If you know how to live from spirit, from Gisemantu, a God as you understand it, from wherever you are, you could not hurt other people. You see, because racism, the way that I see racism, is that of self-hatred.
Yeah.
Otherwise, how and why would you spew negative things if you're not feeling negative in there? Because that's your negativeness, not mine.
Yeah.
Not mine, and I would never accept that. So learning, first of all, you have to know our history. We are the first people of this country. Every one of us, every Indigenous person in Canada and even in the States, the Native Americans there, you need to know where we come from.
Yeah.
And like I said, we don't come from the ribs of man. That came later with the white people that came here. And not only that, but it was the men that came here to our country, of my ancestors and your ancestors, accepting them into our land, into our country, helping them how to live here and survive here, okay? So then they're coming in with only one purpose, and that was get the furs. And our people don't think in terms of 10,000 pelts. You just don't do that.
Yeah.
That's disrespecting Gisemantu just big time, because they knew and they know now too that you only take what you need.
Right.
You don't take 10,000 pelts and ship them off to the Queen of England and make Hudson Bay rich, because that was the only reason why they were here. But anyway, so our ancestors are living their lives. They're doing their sweat lodge, they're doing their sundowns, they're doing the rites of passage. They're living the way that Gisemantu showed them how to live. That's why we're different.
Yeah.
We are different in terms of our thinking and living and feeling, because we are given that spirit from Gisemantu. That's where we come from. So whether you hate somebody or not today, you still have spirit, and you're using that in a wrong way. It's not the right way.
Yeah.
Okay? So then so they're living their lives, they're doing whatever, and these now white people are looking at them and going, what the hell is that? Why are they doing that? How come they're sweating lots when they come out of there? And why are they crazy? Why are they, don't drink and eat for 4 days? What's the matter with them? So it's totally about judgment, okay? And therein lies the problem. From that time of our history, for them to say, what are they doing? Oh, you know what? You're doing the work of the devil. You're evil people doing what you're doing. So how long does that take place in your mind for you to believe it? Did it take 20 days? Did it take a month, a year, 10 years? Like somewhere along the way, Gordon, our people turned on themselves. They began to believe that lie. It is a lie today. And it's hard to undo that because we've been conditioned for how long? 500 years now? Okay? So how do you undo that? I will do whatever I can every single day to undo that with somebody, anybody. I have to teach young people that. That's my role.
That was Elder Belinda Vandenbroeck, and up next is Grandmother Irene Compton sharing their knowledge on the pathways to healing.
What kind of message would you have for Canadians in terms of building a better country and reconciliation?
Well, I always like to look to the medicine wheel for how to respond to everything. So, try and get emotionally attached to this history, like to really understand what happened and to really internalize and feel and imagine what that generation had to go through and the subsequent generations. How we do that emotional attachment a lot of times is through engaging in circles, in ceremony. I get called sometimes just to do family circles just because they want to understand more And by us telling our way of doing things, it transforms that family and on so many different levels. So emotionally getting connected to those stories is important. So you can internalize it, feel it, and understand it. And then mentally to really read up on the history or to go to those podcasts or, connecting to those people that are telling those stories so that you can mentally and academically take it into your mind and try and understand it. I mean, physically, there's so many things people are doing nowadays. This guy just from Washington Lodge, he did a paddle. What he did is he paddled the traditional Algonquin trading route here in Ottawa, and he's raised awareness through his own social media. And so he's got a following and he's raised a lot of money actually and awareness. That's really important, is the awareness to really focus on the issue and listen to those stories and create that awareness. So physically doing things like he's riding a bike. I mean, he's doing the paddle boat, but there's so many other physical things that you can do. Thielen Kicknothway just did a walk for violence against women across Canada and raised so much awareness because he's got a lot of gifts that he carries. He's a hoop dancer and he's a good speaker and he knows all the issues and he's young. And so he connects to all those different generations. So, just following these really fantastic Indigenous youth, they have so much to say and so many great ideas. So emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. So we have a beautiful culture and we like to share it, but a lot of times people try to appropriate our culture. And so that's where, it has to be clear that we'll share the culture with you, but you are from your own culture. So it's important that you find out what's in your culture that gives you meaning and strength. You can experience our culture, but going back to your own culture and focusing on the strengths of that culture and walking in the world with that culture is really important. So we have different gatherings, spiritual gatherings, like a powwow is a spiritual gathering. Washington Lodge has women's retreat weekend where we have, ceremony through the whole weekend and workshops and coming together of all the nations of people, not only Indigenous people. So trying to experience, and like I said, not to appropriate and to really soft moccasin your way into the community, because sometimes people just come in and feel like they're entitled to a lot of things, and it's not the way to do it. You just have to be really humble and be a good listener and, soft moccasin your way in. Don't forget that you have a culture of your own that will give you meaning and strength, and you can just share with our culture. So that's the medicine wheel of how they can help in their own ways.
Up next, Métis grassroots organizer Gabrielle Fayant sharing her thoughts on where we are today in terms of reconciliation and where we need to go. You mentioned that you're kind of involved in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action.
Yeah.
Like, what extent are you involved in that?
Yeah, so in 2016, I was appointed as a special advisor to Minister Carolyn Bennett. And she originally approached us to create an Indigenous youth council for her department. However, like I was here during the closing of the TRC. I worked at the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And I had also been involved in a lot of youth councils and advisory bodies. And so I know how quickly Indigenous youth are tokenized, especially if you put them in like a huge system like the federal government. And we also knew that we wanted to work on a response to some of the calls to action. And so some of the young people I was also appointed with, we agreed that we actually wanted to work on a response to TRC Call to Action 66. And so 66 talks about multi-year funding for Indigenous youth organizations like A7G that work on reconciliation and healing, as well as building a network of best practices. And so we did a huge report on it. We visited communities, we visited young people. We had a gathering here in Ottawa. We also did like a survey, and we heard from young people. However, our report was shelved almost automatically. Yeah.
Why do you think that?
I just don't think they believed us when we said that this was the best approach. I think that they thought they could do it quicker or easier or for less money.
Yeah.
And essentially, like, there's still no multi-year funding for Indigenous youth groups. And we actually during that time met with Senator Murray Sinclair Ba, and
The lead senator.
he obviously encouraged us to do this work.
Yeah.
But he said, you know, just remember that this work might not happen in your lifetime. And so that's the unfortunate part about this work, is that even though it's so urgent that young people need that support right now, like even every minute that passes, you know, young people need that support. But you know, like I often think of like survivors of residential schools, and you know, they had so many challenges and survive so much violence that, you know, we can't let this stop us.
Yeah.
Like we have to do this work in their honor, and you know, be just as strong as they were.
And now Cree lawyer Anita Cardinal shares her honest reflections on advancing reconciliation. And more of this with Garrison Garrow of the Indigenous Arts Center.
What comes to mind when you hear the word reconciliation?
Setting things right. And I also like have heard other elders talk about reconciliation, about like how oftentimes it's put on Indigenous people to lead the way, and or it's oftentimes put on our shoulders to be the ones to be doing the hard work, when this is work that needs to be done by the government, by organizations, by all of the things that were put in place and to suppress us, to commit genocide against us.
Yeah.
So all of that hard work must be done. You know, I mean, Indigenous people, what do we have to reconcile with? Like, this is stolen land we're on. Like, I mean, so it's like, yes, we have to come together, but I mean, Indigenous, they're constant on here, like, oh, we have to come meet in the middle. Like, I mean, I think reconciliation, when you're looking at it from and, you know, as non-Indigenous people, as the government, they need to come this way and do that hard work so that we can finally come together in the middle. And so reconciliation, like I said, is not an end goal. It is a journey that we are all on together. But let's recognize the imbalance of that work.
Yeah.
And how it's still being enacted today. Like
Right.
land acknowledgements, you know, we see these land acknowledgements, and now I see Indigenous people being asked to do land acknowledgements. Well, why are we being asked to do land acknowledgements? We know whose land we're on. It's you who need to do the land acknowledgements, on acknowledging land that you're on and whose land it is, and traditional territories, and then how you can do to do your best, like with regards to like non-Indigenous people and organizations that are doing these land acknowledgements and government aid. They need to, you know, it's their job to recognize whose land they're on. We know whose land we're on.
Garrison, what does reconciliation mean to you? Like, what comes to mind?
It's a tough one because I think my answer probably changes, you know, all the time. But I think what Eric was talking about makes a lot of sense. And you spoke about letting someone else lead. I think that's kind of the key thing that's always been running through my mind when I think about reconciliation, because it's, you know, for a long time, the future for Indigenous peoples was disrupted. It was put on hold. It was sidetracked. It was someone else took over and steered us in a completely different direction and that we wanted to go in. So we kind of like lost time, where we don't know what could have come. So imagine 400 years of us living on this land, what we could have turned that into, the understanding that we had, the connection with nature, and just the way that we lived our lives. What could that have been, you know, after 400 years? What could it have how could the world have changed? But that was all just suddenly stopped. So to me, reconciliation is, yeah, okay, now let us do our thing again. Let us decide what our future is going to be. Let us decide how we're going to live upon this land, how we're going to speak, how we're going to address all these things that have been disrupted and set aside. So reconciliation is something that, I don't know if we're ready to use that word at this point in time, because like a lot of people said in the past, we still have to get to the truth first before we can decide we've reconciled with something. And how do you do reconciliation when a lot of people really don't know the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, in North America and South America? They don't understand what has happened, and there's a lot of people that are still in denial of us when we talk about this because it's not in their history books.
Right.
There's a lot of things that we have to deal with first before we get to that point in time, but we do have to go in that direction.
Algonquin Mark Forgette lays out the simplicity of taking steps towards reconciliation, and Professor Peter Kulchyski helps us to confront the reality of how reconciliation can be furthered within our own current political system. Why is the process of truth and reconciliation important for all Canadians to be a part of? And what is your hope for the future generations?
Well, again, I mean, we know that we lost Murray Sinclair a couple weeks ago, and he laid out the roadmap for us on what it will take in order to rebalance our nation so that we can work together, we can share this land together. And so I think it's up to us now as Canadians, and each and every Canadian, to read the 94 calls to actions. They're not that long. There's only 94 of them.
How does one access these 94 calls?
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has these little orange little booklets. These are little pocket books that are available. I think they're about $7. You can go to Truth and Reconciliation Commission and order your little orange book, and it's simply the 94 calls to action. And they're short. You probably read this in about 20 minutes. And it's important because I think we all have a call to action. As an individual, as a corporation, as a government, as a public servant, we all have a call to action. And if we all just pick one, and if we took call to action number 80, for example, which is Truth and Reconciliation, if we all decided to show up on September 30th to a ceremony, that is a call to action. You've just completed your call to action. You've gone to a ceremony to listen to the survivors, to stand, shoulder to shoulder and show them that, we care about them. We are here with them. It's not complicated. Grab another call to action. If you're a public servant, that's call to action number 57. You don't know what that means to you. Bring it to your colleagues, bring it to your supervisor going, hey, this is our call to action. What are we doing? What are we doing? It's not complicated, but I think the first step is reading all 94 calls to action.
My last question for you, Peter, is about reconciliation. What are your thoughts on reconciliation? How can we make Canada a better country, at least move toward in that direction?
And there's some different kinds of answers that I would say. One thing I would say is that the courts themselves came up with the notion of reconciliation. The Supreme Court of Canada said a reconciliation is about Indigenous people's claims finding a way to fit within Canadian sovereignty. And I'm not happy with that definition or that understanding of reconciliation, but it's important to say that's where the courts have gone, and they've used that word. And it was partly that and partly the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that brought the term more to the forefront. So I don't want to see that kind of reconciliation where, the mainstream of Canada just behaves like it normally does, and Indigenous people find a way to fit their claims within that. That's, to me, not proper reconciliation. And much of what the government calls reconciliation falls under some version of that paradigm. The strongest way of reconciling, for me, would be if we all learned from Indigenous ways of life and started adopting those values in the way we all live. Not calling ourselves Indigenous peoples, but calling ourselves caring and sharing peoples. And, trying to learn from Indigenous peoples how to live a good ethical and a good rewarding lifestyle, democracy. So as something if the rest of society, I think, learn from Indigenous peoples and then brought that into the way in which, we're living in the modern world today. I think something genuinely valuable could come of that. But that would involve, I would say, systemic change or revolution or something, that doesn't seem to be on the foreseeable future. So within the Canada that we have, I still think there are things we can do that would deserve to be called reconciliation. For example, in the membered treaties, I'm living in Treaty 1 territory right now. The membered treaties almost all have clauses that support Indigenous people maintaining their way of life. And you have the land set aside for reserves and land set aside for Crown uses like municipalities and so on. The rest of the land is now called Crown land. I believe that what's called Crown land should be jointly managed. The Treaty First Nations have still special rights and special claim on lands they're supposedly surrendered, which have become Crown lands, where there's, nothing on that land, it's bush. But the government of the provinces and the federal government, for that matter, they never saw a piece of bush that they didn't want to turn into something that's worth some money, even if it's a parking lot. They like any other purpose than leaving the bush. And so if Indigenous people had the right to have more of a say over what happened on Crown lands, I think it's not as far as a land back process, it's a joint process. But I would say if I think about what's viable within the existing political reality that doesn't look like revolutionary change, then for me, reconciliation is about giving more Indigenous people more control over more lands and waters, so that more people could live a land-based lifestyle, so that more people could show respect for that, and so that the language and culture would actually have homelands, not reserves, but homelands where they could survive and hopefully thrive. I don't think that's unattainable within the parameters of the existing political system, but it takes political will.
And we have here Dan and Nancy sharing their thoughts on reconciliation before closing the circle with Anishinaabe Finnish singer-songwriter and speaker Natasha Fisher.
And I have a couple more questions. This one is about reconciliation. And if you have a message for Canadians about reconciliation and how we can make Canada a better country to live in, what would you say?
I'd say listen to Indigenous leaders, consult with Indigenous people, work together, and make sure the government at all levels, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, that they deliver on the promises they make.
Then?
Yeah, the listening and really hearing what's said and really embracing conversations. Conversations like we're having right now. If we hadn't started out on this journey, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, and I'd be the lesser for it. So embracing the conversations, maybe today is a moment for shared healing, and maybe something good can come out of something terrible.
So I wanted to end this, as we always do, we end our podcast by asking our guests about reconciliation. It's part of what we do here at the Legacy Hope Foundation. We try to create a better understanding about Indigenous culture to non-Indigenous people across Canada. And it's our small part that we play in providing information to the public about Indigenous people. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on reconciliation and, that word alone and what it means to you?
Yeah, so reconciliation, when I think of that, I think of a lot of different things, and one of them being like reparations, which some have already been happening, some have already been taking place. Reconciliation comes with healing for both parties, I believe. And for me, I think of land back. And land back not meaning just strictly like give us the land back, by meaning like give Indigenous people spaces within these communities, like to heal and grow, like more Indigenous businesses, more Indigenous funding, more Indigenous representation, which we've already seen happening, and all of these things together, because it's a tricky thing, right? We're all still healing. We're all still recovering. Some of us are reconnecting. For me personally, I'm reconnecting to art forms, traditional art forms. And that's been a part of my recovery and a part of my healing journey is reclaiming that because of what my dad wasn't allowed to do and what my grandmother wasn't allowed to do. And, reconnecting in those forms and then being able to pass those on to my children. And all of that, just healing is where I'm at right now, encouraging healing, encouraging sobriety, encouraging the red road. That's where my heart's at because all of us are hurt in some way or form from generational trauma and from what happened in the past. But I believe that after these turning points, after these, truthful moments, is now an opportunity for us to grow and to heal and to come together, to unify. And I believe that that's all part of reconciliation.
Thank you for tuning in to this special episode of the Roots and Hoots podcast on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The accompanying activity booklet for this episode can be found on our website and as a link in our episode show notes. To learn more about the Legacy of Hope Foundation and the work we do, please visit legacyofhope.ca. And now please enjoy Run As One by the band Seaweed.
Ancient treaties denied. 1990 called it Indian summer. You could feel the beat of a distant drummer, so strong with pride. Side by side we shared a social changing tide. Got you run as one now, it's begun. Feel the beat of a different drum and close our ranks and give our thanks to the spirit up above. Children's children.